welcome everyone again to part 3 of our Shroud adventure, exploring the enduring mystery of the Shroud. Last week, as I am wont to do, I talked too long, and the result was I didn't finish all my slides. So in an adept artistry, I moved some of these slides into the beginning of this one, which means I'll probably be in even more trouble. So I'm going to try to actually not talk faster, but talk more succinctly and more directly to the points so that we get through the slides. Today we're going to talk about history, but first we still have to talk a little bit about the science, because last time we didn't quite get finished. The main thing we didn't get to is some of the more recent science, which suggests that some reasons why the carbon-14 date is likely spurious. The predominant reason is that the area from which the sample was taken appears to be uncharacteristic of the Shroud as a whole. No one is impugning the honor of the carbon labs. No one is claiming that the piece of cloth that they dated was dated incorrectly. The problem is that date, in fact, representative of the Shroud? There is some reason to believe that it's not. Ray Rogers, when he first heard about this idea that there could be a French invisible weaving that would have introduced foreign material that was contemporary at the time, 16th century material, that would skew the carbon date. When he first heard that, he said, these people are crazy. I can disprove them in 5 minutes. He told his friend Barry Schwartz that. And to do that, he took out some fibers he had, which were from that area of the Shroud. He had them because Reyes, you might remember, had taken a sample in 1973, and the carbon-14 sample was taken adjacent to the Reyes sample. So Ray Rogers got out some threads he had, he looked at them, and he confirmed a couple of things. One of the things he confirmed was that the threads had been manipulated. They contained cotton fibers, and the Shroud as a whole is a pure linen fiber, a pure linen cloth, woven from pure linen. There's no appreciable cotton anywhere on the Shroud except cotton that's gotten on the Shroud from people leaning over or touching it and stuff like that. And lo and behold, Rogers finds cotton not merely lying on the thread, but intertwined with the thread. Moreover, when the sample was being investigated, it actually fell apart into 3 pieces, and one of the pieces that it fell apart into was a piece of gum resin that was being used to actually attach the pieces together. And that's when he said, okay, maybe these guys are really onto something. Then he did something else. He looked, did some further microscopy, and he found that the fibers that he found had been encrusted with dye stuff. And he also found madder root, which is a dye, alum, gum arabic, and a very interesting test is a test for vanillin. Now, vanillin's related to the spice vanilla, and it smells really good, and it's exuded by lignin, which is a material that is at the roots of plants. So if you look at a linen fiber, a tiny linen fiber looks very much under the microscope like a piece of bamboo. And as you go up the bamboo, there's these little root nodes in the bamboo, and those are lignin, and that lignin exudes vanillin, but it only does it for a period of time. And so very, very old linen tests negative for vanillin. There isn't any vanillin left. It's all slowly, I'll use the word evaporated, but I'm not sure that's quite the right word. And Ray Rogers looked at that as a possible way of distinguishing between old linen and young linen that's independent of the carbon-14 date. And he published some preliminary findings, and later he published a rather complete complete paper in, I can never remember how to pronounce this. Well, we have a picture of the reference. The point was that from a chemical point of view, the cloth was unlike the rest of the cloth as well. And there's that is Thermochemica Acta. That's a prominent chemical journal. Ray Rogers published a peer-reviewed paper in that journal reporting on his results. The conclusion was that the shroud, there's substantial evidence that the shroud's actually older than the carbon-14 date. And Philip Ball, writing in Nature Online, found the vanillin data in particularly quite interesting. Why is that interesting? Well, vanillin, the time it takes for vanillin to slowly leave a cloth, especially an ancient cloth, because in ancient times the bleaching techniques didn't take all the lignin and vanillin out of the cloth. More modern techniques take a lot of it out of the cloth, but older cloths did not have this. And Ray Rogers and an associate did some studies and concluded that when vanillin reaches the point of extinction, and extinction in this case isn't that there's no vanillin there, but it's gone to a level so low it can no longer be detected by chemical tests. When it goes to extinction, it is at least 1,300 years old if it was stored in very warm conditions. If it's stored in normal conditions, it would be 2,000 years to get to extinction. And if it was stored in cold conditions, it would be 3,000 years old to get to extinction. Now, in all probability, the shroud would probably have been stored typically in normal conditions, so it would be at least around 2,000 years old if it didn't test for vanillin. Now, you can't tell for sure because the shroud was in a fire. And the fire, if it reached all of the sensitive parts, would have accelerated the release of the vanillin. But the interesting thing is, an old shroud, or a shroud that had been heated substantially, would have had all its vanillin extracted. It would all have been evaporated away. And the fibers that Rogers was testing from the sample area tested positive for vanillin. That means that those fibers at least were very young, but the shroud as a whole does not test positive, it tests negative for vanillin. So that's not a very precise test, but it's a very binary test. It says yes or no, and the fibers from the area of the patch test no, that is, there is vanillin present, so that area is young, and that's what the C14 people said. But the rest of the cloth tests no vanillin and hence is old. So that's interesting. Now, another gentleman, Giulio Fanti, who is an Italian researcher, his doctorate is in, I believe, mechanical engineering. He looked at this work of Rogers because he was very aware of it. I met Giulio in 2008 at the Columbia conference in Columbus, Ohio. One of the things Giulio understood was, hey, you don't have to just date with C14. There are other possibilities. One of the possibilities he considered was the mechanical characteristic of linen fibers. The mechanical characteristics, things like the breaking point, things like the degree of resistance to twisting, those things would, as the cloth gets older, change in value. And so what Giulio Fanti did is he got 9 ancient fabrics, ranging from contemporary to quite recent, from contemporary to quite ancient, 5 from Egypt, 3 from Israel, 1 from Peru. And he applied tests to these fabrics and he created a calibration curve based on the 9 fabrics. Then he took fibers he had from the shroud and tested them. Those fibers came out based on the different tests as 300 BC plus or minus 400 years, 200 BC plus or minus 500 years, and 400 AD plus or minus 400 years. The tests are obviously not as precise as carbon-14, but they're significant, and they all suggest that the shroud is quite old, consistent with possibly being the burial shroud of Christ. When you combine those statistics statistically, you get 333 BC plus or minus 250 years. That's a pretty good result. Now there is a small problem, and that's that the result is a little bit ad hoc. What does that mean? Well, Giulio developed these tests specifically to test linen fibers. And so there isn't a large body of technology that supports this testing methodology. So that's going to have to emerge with time. People are going to have to do it. That's the way science works. You know, one experiment really doesn't count for very much. It's a vote of one. 2 experiments that confirm one another is a vote of 2, and it still might not be accurate. You've got to get a body of consistent data before you can say that you've got a slam dunk here. But nevertheless, the dating status currently is 4 for 5. Okay, Vanillin suggests the shroud's authentic, and Fonte's 3 mechanical tests, which are independent tests, different kinds of tests of different properties, say it's authentic, and only the carbon-14 is anomalous, and that particular result has been shown to be on materials that have very doubtful provenance. They have dyes on them, they have binders on them to attach things, they have interpolated fibers of cotton on them. All of those things suggest that this is an area that was manipulated. We don't know when it was manipulated, but we do know that there was a practice, a very nice practice, very reverent practice, of cutting little pieces out of the shroud and giving them as relics to things like monasteries and nunneries, and they would put them in a reliquary and keep them. And then the owner of the shroud, who had taken the relic from presumably a rather unimportant part of the sheet, just like the area where the shroud sample was taken for C14, then proceeded to have the area repaired. So it's not implausible that this could be a repaired area. And there's other data which I don't have time to go into, but if you wanted to get real interested, there's a gal named Pam Moon. Pam has been all over this particular topic. She's been taking and showing pictures, examining the micrographs, and doing a lot of work, and she's found all kinds of anomalies, including stitching that nobody had even noticed before, which just shows how carefully people look at these kinds of things. And before she's done, she's going to have probably published the definitive work on why the patch from the C14 data is totally bogus. So we'll see. Well, next time, this is next time, but this was going to be the last slide. Next time we're going to look at the history of the shroud. Where did this thing come from? And it just happens to be Ash Wednesday, so if you notice my forehead's a little dirty, this is probably a particularly good time to be looking for origins, because it's Ash Wednesday, and on Ash Wednesday, if you go in and they put ashes on your forehead, they say something like, this is my mother's way of phrasing it, they actually use a shorter formula. My mother used to say, remember, man, that thou art dust, from dust thou came, and unto dust thou shalt return, which is sort of a humbling experience, especially when a whole church full is getting ashes rubbed on their faces. And I thought it was really cool this morning because even the little kids who came up, with their moms and dads were getting ashes on their foreheads, and they just looked thrilled, that they could be part of the liturgy. So that was kind of neat. Well, let's go on then. We're going to look at the history. Well, where are we? Well, we've looked a little bit at the religion. We've seen a substantial amount of correspondence between the markings on the shroud, the wounds, the blood, and the passion narratives in the Gospels. We have seen last time that science has tended to corroborate the shroud. The blood is blood. The blood went on before the image went on. The image is anatomically accurate. It meets forensic experts who have looked at the image, have no difficulty interpreting it. There are hidden things that you don't see on an image, but which are there, like the fluorescence around the blood stains that they detected, which no artist would ever even think of putting on, especially in the 14th century. There's dirt from Jerusalem on the heel. I mean, it gets a little bit wild when you find these things. There's dirt on the nose and dirt on the knee. There's abrasions on the back where you'd be carrying a cross. This is kind of eerie in a sense, because a lot of this stuff wasn't really being looked for. It was found as an afterthought as they were studying the shroud. But that produces another problem, because we only trace the shroud back with particular authority, with virtually day-by-day provenance, to about 1355 maybe, and even that's a little doubtful exactly when it was first exhibited in Liry, France, or Luray. I have a friend who speaks French, and she is forever trying to correct my French pronunciation, and all she manages to do is confuse me. So now, because I never remember which one is it, was it Larry, what, anyway, it's L-I-R-E-Y. That's where it was first shown to people. But we don't even know exactly when. We think about 1355. It had to be then. Well, we'll get into it. Let's take a look at the history, and then but we have a problem, because if the shroud's authentic, where was it before 1355? So where do we begin? Well, we can think maybe that there's two beginnings. I got 1353. I'll give it like 1343 to 1355. Because 1343 is when Geoffrey de Charny chartered the church. And he had to have a motivation for wanting to charter a church. So there's a suspicion that he might have had the shroud and he wanted to put it in the church. He chartered a church in 1343. Now, in 1356 he was dead. So, because he died on the battle of Poitiers. So somewhere around there, the shroud appears in history. From there on, it's a matter of public record. But then there's the primary beginning. If the shroud is authentic, then it begins in a tomb in Jerusalem, in the reign of Pontius Pilate, either in 30 BC or in 33 BC. We're not really sure when Christ was crucified. 30 and 33 BC are the dates that fit the best. Okay. So let's look at the known history. The shroud appears in Liry, France. Notice now I've got 1349 to 1354. Why 1349? Well, there was a fire in 1349 in the cathedral at Besançon. That's my French friend explaining that Besançon is not the way you pronounce Besançon. So Besançon had a cathedral kind of place where they had a shroud. And in 1349, the cathedral burned down and the shroud was thought to have been lost. So maybe, just maybe that shroud was in fact the shroud that ends up in Geoffrey's hand. We don't know. We do know that Geoffrey died on 19 September 1356, defending the King of France He was the bearer of the oriflamme, which is the banner of France, and someone came to spear the king in the midst of the battle, and Geoffrey de Charny took the spear, took one for the king, and that was the last one he took. He had been an extremely vigorous and well-proclaimed knight. He had been all over the place. And reading, he actually wrote 3 books on chivalry. So Geoffrey de Charny is a fascinating guy. Now, we have this interesting thing, which is a pilgrim's medallion. This medallion, in the Middle Ages, pilgrims, when they went to a pilgrimage site, would often get little pins and things. It's like we go to places and we get souvenirs. Get a little snow globe with Santa Claus and snow falling on them, or whatever it is. Or you go down to. I was in the airport at Albuquerque, New Mexico, one time, and that was really an odd place because they were selling rattlesnake heads. You could buy yourself a little crystal globe, like a snow globe with a rattlesnake head in it. I think it was probably formaldehyde it was in or something. It was really kind of weird. I told my wife I almost got one for her, which isn't true, but it really kind of creeped her out. So anyway, this is a medallion, and they would get medallions at these sites when they went on pilgrimage. This medallion was actually found in the Seine River in 1855, but it's a medallion of an exposition of the Shroud of Turin, which is fairly evident by the image of the front and back of a man here. By the way, this medallion is only 6.2 centimeters by 4.5 centimeters. So it's a little bit bigger than 2 inches on one side and about 1.5 inches or so on the other side. So it's only a little thing. But it's quite detailed, so somebody put a lot of effort into making this, and it shows 2 coats of arms. These are interesting because the coat of arms on the left is the coat of arms of Geoffrey de Charny. The coat of arms on the right are the Duvergy arms, the arms of Jeannie Duvergy, who was the wife of Geoffrey de Charny. And Dan Scavone likes to, who's a historian, we'll talk about Dan along the way here. Dan likes to point out that the presence of Jeannie Duvergy's arms suggests that she had something to do with the shroud. It's not just Geoffrey, it's Jeannie Duvergy. And Jeannie Duvergy comes from a very interesting family, which we'll touch on as we go forward. This is an image of the Battle of Poitiers. This is Geoffrey de Charny going down. Geoffrey de Charny was lord of, I can't pronounce these words. He was lord of those places, and he was not a very wealthy knight. He was a very respected knight. He was a member of the Order of the Star. In fact, he was one of the founding members of the Order of the Star in the French, and that was a group of knights that valued honor above all things and vowed never to run in battle. Well, he didn't run at the Battle of Poitiers. On the other hand, maybe he'd be alive a little longer had he done so. Interestingly enough, he was so honored that the king, 2 kings, and I can't remember which kings are which, but the first king made an endowment for the church he was endowing in 1343, and another endowment was made by the next king. So they changed kings in the middle here. And this is the one that he defended in battle, but this is before the battle. The endowment was, so 2 endowments were made for this church. The church was founded in 1353, finally, and it was dedicated, and it was eulogized by the local bishop. We're going to see this guy again, Bishop Henry de Poitiers, Bishop of Troyes. This is a reproduction of an image of Geoffrey de Charny II, who is the son of Geoffrey de Charny I. They are said to have looked very much alike, so this gives you some idea of what Geoffrey de Charny looked like. Now, there is another bishop, and this is one of the things that makes interest in the shroud so fascinating. This bishop, Bishop Darcus, Bishop of Troyes, who succeeded Henry of Poitiers, he was bishop from 1378 to 1395, and around 1389, he is supposed to have written a memo which was found, a draft of the memo was found in the archives of someplace, not the Vatican, or not the archives in Troyes, indicating that, complaining to the Avignon Pope Clement VII, that some bad things were going down in his diocese. People were showing fake relics. And he knew they were fake relics because he said his predecessor, Bishop, by the way, he was responding to a presentation of the Shroud of Turin, which it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin at that time because it was kept in Leary. And the predecessor bishop, he claimed, Henry de Poitiers, had declared the shroud a forgery. And he said he had interviewed the painter, and that pretended miracles were staged to validate this relic. And he was outraged. He wanted the Pope to immediately forbid them to do that, and by the way, give him the relic. I think he had more than, a little backstory is that he was building a cathedral at the time and needed money. And all the money was going off to Leary, this little church in Leary, to see the shroud. All the people were coming. At least that's what people say. I don't know whether how I hate to malign somebody who's been dead so long. So the bishop was ordered. Now, interestingly enough, what did the Pope do? Now, this is in supposed receipt of this memo, which the Pope, by the way, there is no sign in the Vatican archives the Pope ever, or the Avignon archives or wherever, there's no sign that the Pope ever received this. But the Pope told the bishop to shut up under pain of, the condition was he was told to go into perpetual silence and not to stop complaining about this thing. But he also told them to stop calling it the true shroud when they exhibited it, that they should call it a representation of the shroud, which they did for a while, until everything blew over and this guy went away, and then they went back to doing what they had done before, which is venerated as the true shroud of Christ. So what's going on? Well, this is Jack Marquardt. He's a historian. I've got three that I'm going to mainly feature, but there's others floating around. But Jack, Ian Wilson, and Dan Scavone are the three kind of shroud historians that I find interesting. Jack kind of blew up the Darcus memo when he showed that there really wasn't one. That the memo that had been published was actually composed of fragments of two other documents. Well, that kind of blew a hole in the case. The guy that had done it, a fellow named Chevalier, who was very, very prominent, I think he's a Jesuit. You can't trust those Jesuits, right? I'm Jesuit trained, I can say that. I went to Jesuit high school and Jesuit college, so I can say you can't trust those Jesuits. That's not fair. You can trust about half of them. The good Jesuits versus the bad Jesuits. But anyway, and then people change sides on which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones. It's kind of amusing. Because there's a lot of liberals, shouldn't use that word. Anyway, my dear friend Chevalier was, who created this document, he's been dead a lot longer than long before I was born. He got a gold medal for this, which was presented by the French Academy of Inscriptions in 1901. Notice 1901. What was going on in 1901? In 1901, they were debunking the Secunda Pia photographs. So he kind of got rewarded for being one of the best debunkers. Interesting. So the research subsequent to the 1898 photograph of Secunda Pia pretty much deflated the significance of the darkest memo because there isn't any paint on the Shroud of Turin. So we're going to come back to this. This is an interesting historical interlude. What was Bishop Darkis talking about? And it turns out Dan Scavone thinks he knows exactly what Bishop Darkis was talking about. And it's fascinating. So there are tons of documents, and I'm not going to go through them, but there's a whole bunch of correspondence between the various, the Avignon Pope and the folks that are showing the shroud. The memorandum of Art Darkis is just the last one. And there's an article about all of this in Shroud Spectrum, number 8, called The Luray Controversy by Luigi Fossati. And you can find this online by going to www.shroud.com, PDFs. If you go to just Shroud, and I think it's in your handout, I think I put that one in, and if you didn't get a handout when you came in, they're bound the back table. PDFs, and all the ones that start SSI are Shroud Spectrum International. That's a wonderful little journal. It was put together by a lovely lady named Dorothy Crispino, bless her soul. She died just this past year, but she put it through 42 editions, and it has all the best Shroud scholars. It's one of the only Shroud peer-reviewed journals that devoted itself to Shroud studies. So that's good. So we've got an observation I'd like to make. We've seen the Shroud's not a painting. So as I said, what's the good bishop referring to? We're going to come back to that. And notice the bishop received no support from the Pope or the king. Both of them, not only the Pope told him to shut up. The Pope told him, you must remain silent. And the king, didn't help either, because they went to the king and they said, seize this thing. So that didn't. So what's going on? What does the king know? Does the Pope know something? Maybe. We really don't know for sure, but we do know some interesting things, which we'll come back to. Here's the De Charny-de Vargy period. De Charny is the son of, the son of Geoffrey and Jeannie de Vargy is Geoffrey II. We saw his picture, and he's displaying the shroud. In fact, his displays is what got the good bishop upset. But later, his daughter, Margaret de Charny, inherited the shroud, and she married this guy. I'm not going to even try to pronounce some of these names. But by June of 1418, she was widowed and married somebody else, Humbert of, this guy apparently has a reputation, according to what I read, of being a little bit skeptical about things, but he married Margaret. Margaret's trotting around with this shroud, and they went all over the place. Now, Margaret has no children, and Margaret really doesn't trust her husband, but that didn't matter because he died. And then, he doesn't trust him if she dies, to take care of the shroud, because she's obviously very concerned about this thing. And they move all over the place, and it's kept in various places as they travel. It's almost like they're traveling from great family to great family, to look for a possible home for the shroud for the future. In 1438, her husband dies. In 1443, the Leary canons, these are the people that are running the Leary church that Geoffrey de Charny founded, they want the shroud back. Because they had only given it to Margaret for safekeeping. Now, Margaret has a slightly different point of view. She thinks that her family owns the shroud and she's not going to give it back. And all hell broke loose. I mean, the Leary canons complained to the king, they complained to everybody, and they even were so successful in their complaints that Margaret managed to get herself excommunicated because she wouldn't give it back. Now it's getting kind of ticklish because, you know, these guys are going to come and get it. She's got to find a home that's safe for the shroud, and she does. In 1453, Margaret, a widow with no children, conveys the shroud to Duke Louis I of Savoy, a very powerful figure whose family became the kings of Italy. So now the shroud is in hands that she trusts. Later, the Louis died in 1465, and his son instituted something that's called the cult of the shroud. And he actually had the shroud in a nook in a special church in Chambéry, and that's probably not pronounced right either. Chambéry, whatever. Anyway, whatever it's pronounced, it burnt down in 1532, which is where we got the burns marks we see on the shroud today. And they had a heck of a time getting it out, and we talked about that last time. But the adventure continues. By 1434, the poor Clares, who were in the area of Chambéry, were asked to come in and repair the shroud. And they very carefully cleaned up the burns, put patches around the burns, stitched a backing cloth on because they were concerned that the cloth had been weakened, and overall restored the shroud to something that could be displayed. But meanwhile, Savoy is invaded by French troops. Remember, this is Italy now. And it has to be evacuated, and it's displayed in Turin in May, and it travels around a good deal while things sort out. And the king decides he wants to move his center of power to Turin. Well, how do you do that when everybody in Chambéry has gotten to think that the shroud belongs to them? See, every place you put the shroud, the local community takes a personal interest. It becomes sort of part of the community. So in 1578, the king had an idea because St. Charles Borromeo and his companions wanted to make a pilgrimage to the shroud. And if you go to Chambéry, you've got to cross the Alps. But if you go to Turin, you don't. So the king of Italy was generously offered to bring the shroud to Turin so that St. Charles Borromeo and his companions didn't have to walk across the Alps. How nice. He did. And that was a great excuse because everybody didn't want to make Charles Borromeo walk across the Alps. Except that the shroud never managed to walk back across the Alps ever since. It's been in Turin since then. And it's been exposed, not frequently, but always to huge crowds. This is an exposition, I think, in the 1600s depicted. So you can see that the shroud's being held by clerics. Notice how kind of crude the image is. There are tons of images of the shroud. And they're on cloth, they're painted on the sides of buildings, They're on flags that were flown. There was a flag with the shroud on it flown at the Battle of Lepanto when this collection of forces turned back the Muslims who were attacking. The signet flag on Don Juan of Austria had an image of the Shroud of Turin on it. So it's interesting that so when you hear that there are hundreds of shrouds, you know, the debunkers of relics love to say there are hundreds of shrouds. There are. And the vast majority of them are paintings of the Shroud of Turin, which is kind of interesting. But there's no reason to believe that there might not have been more than one cloth that would be legitimately and accurately said to be a shroud. Well, now we're pretty much, when we get to 1898, we're pretty much to where we talked about last time, so there's not much more to say about that. All of a sudden, the world changes. One photograph, and the shroud goes from something that everybody thought, well, that's a pious thing, that's nice, they put this thing out every 25, 30 years, you know, and it's nice that these religious people have something to feel religious about. To all of a sudden, what is this thing? And we're still in the what is this thing phase, because frankly, we don't know. We don't know. How could it be real? Well, if it's real, what does that mean? It means that it must have been in the tomb in Jerusalem in the 1st century. How is that possible? Well, here's the timeline. We've just looked at rather quickly at the known history, which starts somewhere around 1355, give or take 5 years, all the way to the present. But what about all this? It turns out there are a few interesting dates that we can talk about. 70 AD. Anybody know what happened in 70 AD?
The destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem?
Jerusalem was destroyed. And the Christians got out of Dodge just before it happened and fled to Pella, according to Eusebius. They might have taken the shroud with them then. We don't know, but we do know that it probably was out of Jerusalem, maybe somewhere around then. But we don't know. There's a big question mark. And then in 544, what happened? Well, in 544, well, we'll see a little bit more about it, but in 544, a Persian army was turned back from the city of Edessa. And it was turned back allegedly as a result of a miracle involving a cloth with an image on it. Then we got 944, this cloth, whatever it was, an army picked it up from Constantinople, went to Edessa and said, we want the cloth, give us the cloth. Because in the meantime, Edessa had been conquered by the Muslims. And the people in Constantinople were busy collecting relics. So let's go ahead, though, and we'll break it down. So the known history represents about a third of the timeline. And based on something that I'm going to call the Mandylian conjecture, we can fill in this third, roughly, actually go all the way from 544 to 1204, and we'll talk about that. We still have this problem, and we have this little problem here, the 2 question marks. What's going on there? Well, we'll talk about it. What's the Mandylian conjecture? Well, the Mandylian conjecture is that there was this thing called the Mandylian, which was a excuse me. I didn't realize my computer was making noises. There was the Mandylion was an image of Christ's head, but it was in landscape format, which is very unusual. Usually when you take, that's why they call it portrait format, is that usually a picture of someone's head is in a format that's a little higher than it is wide. So you don't make a landscape portrait and then put a head in the middle of it as a general rule. So that was a little bit unusual. Ian Wilson wrote a seminal book, which, by the way, is another one of those things. If you picked up a copy of John Heller's book, you really ought to take a shot at get one of Ian Wilson's books. And he said in that book, could the Mandylion of the Eastern Orthodox Church have been one and the same as the cloth we know today as the Shroud of Turin? That's what I call the Mandylion conjecture. And the first question we have to ask is, does that work? Does the Mandylion conjecture make sense? And my position is that it does. In fact, my position is that there's such a thread of continuity between the Mandylion conjecture and some reports of an image on a cloth that is hard to imagine being anything but the Shroud of Turin to give warrant to Ian Wilson's idea. And the idea is, in some of the correspondences that point to a positive answer, is the coincidence of the Vignon markings. Now, we mentioned them last time. Last time we mentioned them. We'll mention them again a little later. There's a description in a 6th century document that the image is like a moist secretion. And we know that the shroud has a very, very faint image on it. So that's sort of consistent. The landscape display of the image as depicted in much of the art, and just the unusualness of a landscape display points, as we'll see, to it probably being the shroud doubled in 4. Tetradiplon is the Greek word, and that's what it means, 4 doublings, 8 layers. And then we have a sermon from the deacon Gregory upon the occasion of this Constantinople army recovering the Mandylion from Edessa and moving it to Constantinople. So we'll look at all those things. Okay, so how did the shroud, so we'll look at those. We'll look at them right this second. We're going to go back to this mystery point. Well, if the shroud is the Mandylion and the Mandylion is an image that's in Edessa, how did the shroud get to Edessa? What's that all about? Well, the shroud gets to Edessa. The journey begins on April 3rd, 33 AD. Now, I've got 2 choices. I've got April 7th, 30 AD or April 3rd, 33 AD. Why did I pick April 3rd, 33 AD over April 7th, 30 AD? I'll tell you. There was an eclipse of the moon at sunset on April 3rd, 33 AD. And not so many days later, St. Peter, addressing the crowd, is quoted in Acts 2, 19, 20, quoting the prophet Joel. And I will show portents in the heaven above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness, and it shows up better on the moon to blood. The moon to blood. This is the moon in a total eclipse. Before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Why did Peter choose to use that quote? How about the fact that a few days before, when the Lord was crucified, at sunset, there was a blood moon? So that's why I personally think April 3rd, 33 AD is the right day. Other scholars pick other dates, but only really two dates in contention: April 7th, 30 A.D. or April 3rd, 33 A.D. Another reason I like, which is a little more mystical, is that if it's 33 A.D., then Jesus started his ministry in 30 A.D., and there was a 40-year period of testing while the people had the ability to recognize the truth of the Jewish people had the ability to recognize the truth before judgment would be brought on the city. So from 30 A.D. to 70 A.D. was the judgment period. That's pure speculation, but some people point out that 40 is a very important number in Jewish and even Christian numerology. So for the numerologists, 30 A.D. would be particularly appropriate for the beginning of the ministry. 70 and then 33 A.D. with the blood moon all hangs together. Yes, ma'am.
Just as there are records about when there was the lunar eclipse, April 3rd, 33 A.D. Okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
I got a gadget in my ear this time, so I'm doing a little better than usual.
So just as there are records of this, other records other than in the Christian scripture of the earthquakes that took place.
There are earthquakes. The whole area in Jerusalem is very active. I don't know if there's any specific records saying that in 33 A.D., for example, that a big earthquake took place that maybe tore the veil of the temple,
right.
That sort of thing.
Right.
I don't know. I haven't made a study of that. I'm mainly doing this because, I think I want to justify 33 A.D. and I want to point it in context. But I don't have I do know a guy, I ran into a guy at a Shroud conference, which was a really strange guy who was into mysticism, and, they find me, I think, at breakfast in the hotel. This guy came over and sat down and talked to me, and he was absolutely convinced that somewhere under Golgotha was a tunnel in which was hidden the Ark of the Covenant, and that when Christ's blood was speared and the earthquake took place, the blood fell down through a crack in the ground and fell on the judgment seat or something on the Ark of the Covenant.
I thought the Ark of the Covenant was under the temple.
Well, there's another story that somebody has it off in Ethiopia or something. So
I've read that too.
They might. I mean, nobody's got a picture of it. I'll believe it when they trot it out and show me the. So let's go on here. I'm going way too slow. This is a disaster if we don't get cranked up here. Okay, so a little more scripture. We go into the tomb. It's an interesting thing because John 24:8 talks about, the women have come and said they've taken the Lord, we don't know where he is. And John and Peter run to the tomb, and Schoenfeld wrote a book. He's a Jew who's, I think, an agnostic or maybe even an atheist. He wrote an interesting book called something like the Jesus Conspiracy or something, which I read. And he had an interesting interpretation of this passage. Peter's a fisherman. John is a fisherman too, but he's from a kind of he knows the high priest. He's from a sort of a highfalutin family. He actually let Peter into the place of the high priest at the time of the trial. So they run to the tomb, and John stops outside the tomb, and Peter rushes in. And then John said, well, all right, it's going to make me ritually unclean. I guess I'll go in too. But they saw he bent down. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter, reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in. He didn't go in. And saw the linen wrappings lying there, Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. Simon Peter, you know Simon Peter, he's the rambunctious one who is always getting in trouble. He runs into the tomb. He doesn't care about being ritually unclean or touching grave cloths or anything like that. Into the tomb. And John said, and went in right afterwards, you know. And he saw the linen wrappings lying there. Wrappings, it's plural. There's more than one. The cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, plural, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in. That's John now. And John, he saw and believed. Now, one of the first articles I ever wrote about the Shroud of Turin, I concluded the article by saying, what did John see and what did he believe? The next verse is something, for they had not yet known the teaching about the resurrection. And one person I saw who analyzed this said, so what he believed wasn't the resurrection. He believed something, but what in fact did he believe? And his position, this particular guy, position was that he believed then, for the first time perhaps, that he really was the Son of God. And it was only later that they understood, when Jesus reappeared to them, that he had been resurrected. We don't know. But John saw something significant. But what's this other cloth, the linen one, rolled up in a place by itself? Well, it turns out there's more than one relic of the burial. There is in Oviedo, Spain, a cloth covered with blood. Just covered with blood. And it's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. We're going to look at the Sudarium of Oviedo, because if the Sudarium of Oviedo touched the same corpse as the Shroud of Turin, it will corroborate the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. So we have a missing cloth. Are there any other missing cloths? Yes, there are. There are other relics. Now, are they authentic? Who knows? Unless you look and you study a relic, you can't tell whether it's authentic or not. I mean, relics have a bad rep, but the bottom line is a lot of them are quite authentic. The shroud, was there more than one shroud? It turns out that there's a literary record that suggests there was more than one shroud. There may have been a shroud that was used as kind of a stretcher to carry the body to the tomb. And then it was rolled up in the tomb, because one of the things that is part of Jewish burial is you must preserve the blood that is shed after death, the blood that had contained the life. So you can't, if blood is shed, you should capture it, because it contains the spirit of the person. And then there's actually I have a whole article on the topic about, Jewish practices that was authored. Two Jewish rabbis were consulted, one from Jerusalem, who conveyed the details about this. So people that say, well, the body must have been washed because that was Jewish practice, that's true, but not in the case of people who died a violent death where blood flowed. They had to capture the blood that was in the body, because that blood is part of the life force of the person. So what is this cloth about? Well, the cloth was wrapped around, we'll get to it a little later. There's another cloth, a holy cap, which is kept in Cahors. Now, there's no image on the top of the Shroud of Turin. And the people who like to debunk the Shroud of Turin say, there's no image on the top that can't be authentic. Okay, but there is a tradition that there is a cap that was put on the body, and that might be that jaw thing that kept the mouth closed, but it didn't affect the image, as we talked about last week. There is such a cap. It has bloodstains on it. Now, nobody, to my knowledge, has studied that cap, so it might be authentic or it might not, but it would explain, if it was in place, why there's no bloodstains right above on the top part of the head. So, there's also something called the Veronica. And it's interesting that Veronica means Vera Icon. And Vera Icon is two words. It's sort of a messed up thing because Vera is Latin and icon is Greek. One word means true and the other means image. But there's this history of the Veronica. And we don't know whether the Veronica is a separate cloth, a separate relic. There is a relic being preserved in Manipello, Italy, that is on a very finely woven, gossamer-like, silkish image that you can see through. And some people think it's the Veronica. The only problem is its provenance goes only back to the 16th century. Some people think it's the Veronica and that it was stolen from the reliquary in Rome when Rome was sacked 100 years earlier or something. I'm not sure when that sack took place. Rome's always getting, these various places are always getting sacked. We're going to be seeing another sack very shortly here. Then there was an image at Besançon. Remember Besançon with the fire? Well, the shroud that had been lost had been recovered. And we'll mention that a little later, but the French Revolution came along and they seized this thing and they said, this is a miserable painting, and they had it torn up for bandages to be used for soldiers in the field. The French Revolution thereby destroyed that particular relic. Well, now we've got a shroud in a tomb, and who got the shroud? So this is kind of like musical chairs. Who are the possible candidates that might have gotten the shroud? Well, the mother of Jesus might have gotten the shroud. The Apostle John's fairly logical because he was, after all, one of the first two people to enter the tomb. The Apostle Peter, he was sort of the leader of the pack. He may very well have gotten the shroud. And there's actually some textual evidence that suggests that Peter had the shroud. Joseph of Arimathea owned the thing because he bought it. So, and there's some tradition about Joseph of Arimathea, although it's a very late tradition. And then there's this story about the Apostle Jude Thaddeus, who is likely a relative of Jesus, probably a cousin. And there's a strong tradition that somebody named Jude Thaddeus sent the image to Edessa. But we don't know who's telling the truth. Why all of the silence? Why don't we know about this thing? Why didn't somebody write about it? Well, think about it. If you were a small persecuted community that in fact quite often was taken to places like the Colosseum and fed the lions, covered with tar and mounted in the garden of Nero to be burned as a sort of an ornament at garden parties, persecuted and your books taken out and burned, maybe if you had something you really valued, you wouldn't like to see it talked about in public very much. Now, there's also the fact that burial cloths are ritually unclean. The shroud contains an image, and images were forbidden by Mosaic law, although that's mainly artificial images, but nonetheless, and revealing its existence would just encourage your enemies to seize it. That's probably why we don't hear a whole lot about the shroud. There is a legend, though, and the legend is the legend of Abgar V. Abgar V was the king of Edessa until about 50 A.D. He is supposed to have had something like leprosy, and he heard that Jesus was a great healer, and he sent a messenger to Jesus asking him, hey, I hear that you're not real popular with the powers that be. Why don't you come to Edessa? You can heal me, and we'll take care of you. That's sort of the sum of the message he sent. Jesus is supposed to have sent him back a letter. Some people say he just dictated something to the messenger, and the messenger subsequently wrote what he was dictated and said, I can't come now, but I'm going to send a messenger. And there's a message, a whole story, which is recorded in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history of a messenger, the apostle, or the disciple really, Addai, who was sent by Thomas, the apostle, to the king, and the king was cured. No mention in Eusebius of an image, but the king was cured. Now, there's three takes on the Abgar, on the legend, how, and then we'll take a look at these. On the way, we're going to mention spy clues. Remember, the church is persecuted. The church isn't trying to show people what's going on, but they probably want to know, the faithful need to know about these things. So could the early Christian community have exchanged information about the shroud? Now, at the St. Louis conference, a gentleman gave a talk, and he talked about an example from Galatians, which we'll take a look at. Another writing that I have points out that there's clear evidence that the Christian community had secrets. Although I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk with you face to face so that our joy may be complete. What is John talking about? Now, he says this twice in 2 John and 3 John at the end of both letters. So there's some things I can't write down, but we'll get together and we'll talk about them, you know. I don't know what they are. But there are some early examples in the Apocrypha. There's a thing called the Hymn of the Pearl in the 3rd century, and we'll look at that in a later slide. And there's lots of little things that Reverend Al Dreisbach, bless his soul, he's dead now, but he was a big proponent of what he called spy clues in Scripture and in the Apocrypha that could give you clues about the Shroud of Turin. And here are the 2 John and 3 John quotes, but there's also Galatians, Luke, and John, which we've already seen some of that. Here's Galatians. The Galatians 3, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified. What? You know where Galatia is? It's between Constantinople and Edessa. Here's a Galatia right there. What is this? Before your eyes, Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified. That sounds like the Shroud of Turin, frankly. That's actually something that was suggested by Dr. Frederick Baltz at the recent St. Louis symposium. Nobody had mentioned that one before, but it does sound plausible, possible anyway. And he offered an argument that it referred to the shroud used in Paul's evangelization. Then there's Luke 4. This is mine. I've always been bothered by the fact that these 2 angels, the angels seem to me to be figures of the 2 images on the shroud. 2 men in dazzling clothes. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Why? So you come to and you find a cloth that's got 2 images on it. And what is the message of the cloth? He is risen. He is not here. Who's testifying to that? Well, the image on the right and the image on the left. It's a stretch. And then Peter ran to the tomb, stooped and looked in. This is the same Peter that we saw in John running to the tomb. Saw the linen cloths by themselves. He went in and was amazed at what had happened. So this is an account similar to John's, a little bit different take. Here's John 25 to 10. Again, we saw that a little bit earlier. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. That's the thing I mentioned before. What did John believe? They don't understand the scripture he must rise from the dead. What does he believe? He believes that Jesus was able to leave a shroud. Now, John Jackson believes that the shroud was wrapped around, it was laid over Christ, and then the side strip was wrapped to secure the cloth, and he thinks that the body just sort of disappeared from inside the cloth. That would account for why when you looked at the thing, you say, something strange happened here. It's not that the body just isn't here. It's the wrapping's all still wrapped around. Nobody that stole the body would do that. So we don't know. It's just very strange. Here's Galatia, though. Here is Antioch. Jerusalem is down here somewhere. And this is Edessa. Okay, so these are sort of the geometry. This is Constantinople. So let me go ahead and mention the Hymn of the Pearl. We're going to have to, I want to get you guys a little bit of a break here. The Hymn of the Pearl is in early Syriac. It probably goes back to the early 3rd century. And here's a quote from it. Suddenly I saw my image. This is Christ speaking. Suddenly I saw my image on my burial garment like in a mirror. A mirror? And myself through myself, for myself facing outward and inward, as though divided, yet one likeness. So there's two images, one front and back, but one likeness of the King of Kings. Now this is embedded in an apocryphal work called the Acts of Thomas. And interesting, Thomas is the one who's supposed to have sent the shroud via Adai to Edessa. Now there's some other ancient witnesses, and I want to move ahead, but some of them, one thing is the evolution of the idea that the shroud had an image on it. Eusebius, no image. He mentions the image of the Abgar message, but no image. Then in the late 4th century, we have an account called the Doctrine of Adai, which has the image being painted with choice paints. So now we have an image. By the 6th century, in the Acts of Thaddeus, which is another, we have a Jesus, instead of his image being painted, he washes his face and wipes his face on the shroud. Again, remember we're talking about the image of Edessa, which is only has a face, and it starts being called made without hands. Finally, there's a 6th century Arabic rite in which it says, Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. And finally, in the 6th century, Abbot Gregorius, who is sort of a contemporary of these events, gave an account of how the image sent to Abgar saved the city during the siege of Khosroes the Persian in 544 AD. So now we're in Edessa. Now there's been iconoclasm all through the ages, so images are not always real popular. Sometimes they're seized and destroyed. So there's a lot of reason to be concerned if you have an image. One of the images, one of the horrible ones, is in somewhere around 700 to between 686 BC and 715 BC. There was Jewish iconoclasm, and they destroyed the Nehostano, however you pronounce that. It's the bronze serpent that Moses held up in the desert. And these clowns, well, it's not nice, but they destroyed something that was a relic from Moses. That was one of the things, I think, that was supposed to be kept in the Ark of the Covenant. It got destroyed. Wow. So you got to be careful with these things. Here's now Wilson thinks it's the Mandylion. He thinks it got transferred from Edessa to Constantinople in 944, that it disappeared in the sack of the city, later to reappear in France. Jack Marquardt's chronology is a little different. He thinks the shroud was taken by Peter to Antioch, and that in Antioch, both of these places were constantly under siege, constantly having floods or earthquakes, and the idea was that in either place that the shroud was hidden either for safety or to protect it from natural disaster. In one case here in 362, Julian the Apostate attempted to seize relics of Antioch, and they were hidden by a guy named Theodoratus. Now, and that included the shroud in Jack Marquardt's view, but that he was then martyred and nobody knew where he hid him. And it was only discovered again after an earthquake destroyed the church, and in the rubble they discovered where it was found, hidden. And it was evacuated then to Edessa in advance of the Persian attack. So both ways we get to Edessa. Now, Dr. Scavone, he thinks that there's a mysterious role of Joseph of Arimathea which led to the Grail legends. Now, the only impact this has, Dan is a big Shrouds historian. His view is that the Grail could very well be the shroud. The Grail that is, not that the Grail exists in a sense, but that the myths and the stories brought back by the Crusaders from Constantinople actually refer to the Shroud of Turin. Because the Grail contains Jesus' body, it captures Jesus' blood, it's only displayed rarely in gradual manifestations. And there's a similarity to something called the Edessa Easter ritual and what Robert de Clary saw in Constantinople. What's the Edessa Easter ritual? In Edessa, it was kept in a gold chest, a scrinium, and on Easter it used to change its appearance according to different ages. It showed itself in infancy at the first hour of the day, childhood at the third hour, and adolescence at the sixth hour, and the fullness of age at the ninth hour when the Son of God came to his passion and cross. This sounds like it might refer to a liturgy in which the shroud was shown gradually. We don't know. But this is a text about Edessa. So now we're in Edessa. It's the 6th century, and suddenly there's a shift in the art representing Christ. We got to Edessa anyway. That's pretty good. By the way, this image here is shares many features with the shroud, and it is an image that comes from the 6th century, and it's in the church of St. Catherine in the Sinai, in the middle of the desert, which is why it was preserved so well. Most of these things have been either not preserved well or actually defaced and intentionally destroyed by the various iconoclasts. In some cases, the place was overcome, assaulted, destroyed by the Muslim armies or the Persian armies. The Muslim army currently, the place where the shroud, where some of these images are depicted, is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which is now a mosque. And some of these images are on the walls of that. And these are the images that inspired Paul Vignon to try to make a list of unusual markings that he felt were characteristic of this sudden emergence in the 5th, 6th century of the frontal image of Christ with large eyes, a couple of wisps of hair, a U-shaped thing over the nose, a little V over the nose, a slash across the chest here, which was often misunderstood or represented by artists as a break in the tunic. All of these features which Vignon found on the shroud, and he thought that and Ian Wilson believes that these were features in art that were inspired by the Mandylion. That is the image of Edessa. So what's going on? Here's an image that I stole from an Ian Wilson presentation, discovering more of the shroud's early history, which if you Google discovering more of the shroud's early history, you could find Ian's whole presentation, because I think it's online. I mean, I steal only from the best sources offered by Professor Google, and I do try to check them for some degree of accuracy and credibility. But Ian Wilson is somebody I trust pretty much. He shows here that many of the images of Christ were shown in this landscape format, which is hard to explain. Now, the Mandylion is reported by Vagrius in his history of the church as saving the city from the Persian attack in 544. So that's how we kind of place the image of Edessa, the Mandylion, in Edessa in 544. Now, various people have different stories. There's a story that it was recovered from the wall, that was hidden in the wall of the city to protect it at some point in the past and forgotten, and then recovered in the aftermath of a flood in 525. And there's all kinds of stories. You just don't know what to believe. But this one is, at least from 544 on, it's pretty clear that the image of Edessa was in Edessa. Now, what's the image of Edessa? Ian Wilson believes that what the image of Edessa is simply the shroud folded tetradiplon-like, so that there's 8 layers, and it ends up in a plan form, horizontal configuration. And this is an image of Jude Thaddeus bringing the shroud to Abgar. Now, there's a whole backstory about Abgar, which I don't think we have time to go into, but there's 2 Abgars that are important. Abgar the 5th and Abgar the 8th. In all probability, the Abgar the 5th story is retrojected by Abgar the 8th into the past. Nobody knows whether Abgar the 5th really was converted to Christianity or not. Abgar the 8th clearly was, and he's in the 200s. I don't know what difference that makes, but when you read the historians, they're all over that particular one. So here's what the shroud looks like when it's folded exactly tetradiplon. Okay, so it's in a horizontal configuration with the head in the center. Now, recently at the conference, Petrus Soons published a paper. He actually published a paper a little bit before the conference, and he gave a paper at the conference in St. Louis. And he says that he can detect a halo that's slightly lighter around the head, which would sort of imply that the shroud had been depicted like that, with something overlaying the cloth with a circular or oval thing letting the image of the head through. But since the shroud was only taken out of its reliquary, it was in a gold reliquary in Edessa or in Constantinople, wherever it wouldn't be exposed to the light very often. So you wouldn't expect, it's not like they took it outside and laid it out in the sunlight, but there does appear to be some mild lightening around the head, so that might be. Now this is interesting because this is the lid at Templecombe. It's a wooden panel. Unfortunately, when it was first discovered, it was shown to the local cleric, and he decided he was going to clean it up. He knew nothing about it, so he just scrubbed the surface. And the result was he managed to mess up the image quite a bit in And it was probably more brighter, and if it had been professionally restored, it would have been interesting to see what it looked like. But it's in, again, it's in a horizontal plan form. It appears to have been to be the wooden lid of something. Rex Morgan, who's an Australian shroud researcher, thinks that it was possibly the cover of a reliquary that the Knights Templar may have kept the shroud in. In any case, it's in the tetradiplon kind of horizontal plan form. It has a head. I don't know that the head is, I think the picture is pretty crude and it isn't clear that it's the shroud, but it certainly has the big eyes. Now here is a depiction of the shroud folded in tetradiplon, showing that just on the back side that might have been wrapped around a panel that was securing it, you see the chest wound, and that's going to be very important. This, by the way, is taken with a piece of a shroud that was this long, folded up and lying on my kitchen table. So this is, but that's what it would. That's what it looks like when it's folded tetradiplon. Here's the tetradiplon lid, and here's the chest of the shroud with the man of the shroud. We've mentioned Max Fry. I won't go into him a whole lot more. It is important that he noted that the shroud has pollens from the Holy Land on it. Not only the Holy Land, though, because he has pollens from the Anatolian steppe, which would include Galatia, by the way. Include Galatia and include Edessa. And there's a few pollens from Constantinople. One key thing, and I think it's becoming to a head, is that in all likelihood, these were not necessarily pollens that were either wind-blown or insect-borne. They could very well be pollens that were in aromatic spices or substances that had been laid down on the man of the shroud and then subsequently got on the shroud. Remember last time I talked about the possibility that those two configurations of the cloth might involve spices having been packed by the body. Well, interestingly enough, one of the pollens, the one that Max Fry classifies as a thorn bush, is of a genus that has almost exactly the same shaped pollen as a major plant that was used in the creation of aromatic spices. And it may be a misclassification, and that's kind of coming to the fore since one pollen researcher pointed out that Max kind of went beyond his evidence when he said it was the thorn bush. It could just as well and more likely be this aromatic flower that was used in the fabrication of spices. So that's something that's kind of interesting. So we're in Edessa, and we go up to 944. Now, why 944? Well, the Byzantine Emperor Romanus I managed to reach an agreement with the Muslim authorities, and he agreed to exchange for the Mandylion 200 Muslim prisoners and 12,000 pieces of silver. I guess they wanted the image of Edessa in Constantinople. Now the Christians weren't real happy about this, but they really didn't have much to say about it, because in fact they sent a messenger with the army who had seen the real thing. So the first thing they tried to do is they tried to pass off a copy. That didn't work because the army had with them someone who knew what the real thing looked like. So they got it and they brought it back to Constantinople. And on August 15th, 944, the Mandylion arrives in Constantinople to overwhelmingly popular celebration. The whole city was celebrating that it had arrived. It was taken to the Emperor Constantine VII and his brother-in-laws, and at that time they looked at the image and they described it as a moist secretion as well. We had seen it earlier described as a moist secretion in a 6th century document, but they described it as a moist secretion and difficult to make out. and blood is mentioned. Now remember, this is, up till now, has been presented as a napkin that Jesus rubbed his face against after cleaning his face. It hadn't been mentioned. Blood has not been a major factor. Notice, though, that in a icon, in an image that is, this is a little image in a document that illustrates the document showing the arrival of the Mandylion. Notice the Mandylion is shown, there's a face on it, and it's shown as part of a large cloth. That already suggests the Shroud of Turin. Now, the very next day, August 16th, the Archdeacon Gregory gives a homily. And he says something, I think, very telling in the homily. The splendor has been impressed uniquely by the drops of agony sweat sprinkled from the face. Okay, that's the moist secretion. And the drops of agony are the agony of the Garden of Gethsemane. Because that was the next step in trying to explain. See, all of these descriptions, choice paints, moist secretion, not made by human hands. These are all attempts on the part of people to explain something that they had seen and didn't really have a whole lot of background on. These are truly the beauties that produce the coloring of Christ's imprint, which has been embellished further by the drops of blood sprinkled from his own side. Well, how did Gregory know there was any blood on the Mandylion sprinkled from Christ's side? Unless they had actually unfolded the Mandylion and found that it was the image of, found it was the Shroud of Turin, and that, lo and behold, there was blood, a blood stain on the chest and other blood sprinkled. And this would be right on the back of the folded shroud, right on the back. Blood and water there, talking about the head, and image here, I guess, and blood and water. Blood and water is at this time before the burns, you would have seen the blood and water separating as it separated across the back. An image here. The Mandylion at that point was revealed in Constantinople to be more than just the face of Christ. But it goes a little further. There was a witness at Constantinople, Robert de Clary, a chronicler of the Fourth Crusade, which was sort of a disastrous crusade. It started with the idea of putting the rightful emperor in place at Constantinople, and he was going to pay the army. When they put him in place, he reneged on the deal because he discovered he didn't have enough money to pay the army. And so the Crusaders, you won't pay the army, we'll take it. And they sacked the city. And in the course of sacking the city, they also stole everything that could be moved. These horses, for example, which I forget where they are now, but they were stolen from Constantinople and now ornament a European city. So that's how, I mean, they went to a lot of effort. These are full-size horses, bronze horses, gilded bronze horses. I forget where they are, Venice or someplace. Here's what Robert de Clary said. Robert said, there was another church which was called My Lady St. Mary of Blancheret, Cernay, where there was the cindoins, that is the shroud, in which our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday raised itself upright so that one could see the form of our Lord on it. And no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of this shroud when the city was taken. It was raised up so you could see the form of our Lord. Now, we remember the iridescent Easter ceremony, where at 1 you saw a baby, and at 3 you saw this. And Jesus is transformed from a child to an adolescent to a crucified man. Well, that sounds like an unfolding. He says, raised up. Well, we're going to see something interesting about that. Meanwhile, after the sack of Constantinople in 1204, when the shroud has disappeared, quite an interesting number of traditions, which may be motivated by the shroud, developed in Constantinople and in Eastern Orthodoxy. Some of them had started earlier. Basically, there were little garments, small, not garments exactly, small melismos, which often showed the baby Jesus, and they were used to cover the communion bread before it was sliced. And then there were epitaphoi, which were, this is a rather heavily deteriorated one. I think I have some here's one shown in carved in ivory, which is Christ laid out on a cloth. And these were cloths that were used to lay over the altar. In many cases, they were brought in procession to the altar and laid on the altar. And remember I said there were flowers and there were these little burns that might be due to incense, that perhaps at high holy days the shroud itself was used. And then a very odd sort of artistic depiction begins to appear after 1204, mostly, called the Man of Sorrows, which shows Christ coming up out of a box, which is always said to be the tomb, but it's out of a box, with his arms crossed, similar to the shroud, with a wound on his chest. It's a shroud-like image. And this makes you ask the question, what motivated these images? Obviously Christ, but was it due to the shroud earlier having been in the city? Now, the presence of the shroud is also testified by Nicholas, an Icelandic abbot in 1157, who came back and said he saw a shroud with blood and body of Christ on it. 1157. This is before 1203 when Robert de Clary saw it. Going back further in time, we find an illustration in something called the Hungarian Prayer Codex. This is a document. Hungarian document had small illustrations of Christ being laid out in the tomb, being anointed. And there is a second illustration which appears to have the women coming. They find the shroud. This appears to be the shroud. Why do I say it's a shroud? Well, for starters, it has a pattern on it that looks like a herringbone, intended to convey a herringbone weave. Understand, this image is small. It's in a book. But what about these holes? These are reminiscent of the burn holes on the shroud that may have derived from a Constantinople Easter liturgy that went wrong, where the incense pellets fell on the shroud. So you have the herringbone twill of the shroud. This document dates from between 1192 and 1195. These are all way in advance of the carbon date. Now, when Stirp in 1978 did its work, one of the things they did, I think I mentioned this last time, is they noted that this backlit experiment that was being done by the Italians could be, they thought, gee, let's take a picture of the shroud in transmitted light. And they put a light behind the shroud, and two things immediately emerge. One is that the blood stains are fine. You still see the blood stains. All the blood stains are just, the image has disappeared. This indicates the image is very, very thin. It's very ephemeral. Something else, though, there's a whole bunch of horizontal lines. What are these? Discolorations. John Jackson saw these, and he saw some other data because they also took grazing light photographs. I haven't gotten a good found a good image of the grazing light photographs, which showed the wrinkles in the shroud. And Jackson studied the wrinkles and the discolorations. He concluded that something had made these that was probably pulling the shroud out of a box. And using nothing but the discolorations and where they were, he did an engineering back engineered something that I'll just call the Constantinople device. Here are some images of John Jackson talking about these lines and pointing out that they were regular, that they had structure that suggested a device. He put a device together, and then it was demonstrated in the documentary, a BBC video called Shroud of Turin, BBC The New Evidence. You can see that on, I stole these images with frame capture, but you can, from that video, so you can see the whole video about it online. And here's a couple of these man of pity images, which show Christ, different images, all showing Christ being raised out of a box. And here's the Constantinople device that John made, and he demonstrated it for the film crew, and they pulled a duplicate of the shroud, or representation of the shroud, out of the box. And here it is shown as someone in the Cathedral of St. Mary de Blancheret may very well have seen it, as Robert de Clary did in 1203. That's interesting. There's evidence on the shroud that corroborates exactly what Robert de Clary says. There's evidence of a device that is used to pull the shroud out of a box. Well, the city was sacked in 1204. Everything's shot. We got a lot of slides to do. So what happened then? Margaret de Charny had two things to say about the shroud. One of them was a gift freely given. And the second one was the spoils of war. And you have to understand, the Pope was not happy with what these clowns had done in Constantinople. The leaders of the Orthodox Church, some of the secular leaders, sent letters to the Pope demanding the return of the things that the Crusaders had stolen. The Pope told the Crusaders that they should return everything. Of course, they didn't, under pain of excommunication and things like that. So all of a sudden, to be shown that you were holding on to something that had been taken in the sack of Constantinople, well, it's not a good idea. You were going to have somebody would come and take it from you and try to give it back to those people in Constantinople, and it's ours now. We took it fair and square. We sacked the city and got all the relics. Now they're ours. So nobody ever gave the horses back. Nobody ever gave the shroud back. But it wasn't bandied about that that's where we got it. We've seen now there's two stories that you have to kind of look. One is that this fellow named Othon de la Roche, who was a major figure in the Crusades, he ended up being the Duke of Athens. He was given Athens, and there is documentation that he got the shroud, took it to Athens, where it proceeds to disappear. Nobody knows what happened to it, except there is documentary evidence that he was holding it in Athens, and that one of the leaders of Athens wrote to the Pope and said, make him give it back. Disappeared. Okay, so what happened? Did it go to the Knights Templar? Did it go to Geoffrey de Charny? How do you tie this together? Well, there's a couple of stories. Here's the simple story. Othon de la Roche captures the shroud during the sack, takes it to Athens, where he's been awarded the fief of Athens, and then this letter is written by the despot of Epirus, which is part of Greece, and who wrote Pope Innocent III wanting the shroud back. Sometime, not known, Othon ships the shroud back to Burgundy, where it ends up finally in the Cathedral of Besançon, from which Jeanne de Chabergy, who is a descendant of Othon de la Roche, conveys it to her husband Geoffrey de Charny as part of her dowry. Pure speculation. It's a reconstruction by Dan Scavone, but it's fairly convincing in some respects. There's a few complications. 1349, the cathedral in Besançon burns down, and the shroud there is said to be lost. 1377, the missing Besançon shroud is discovered in a niche in the rebuilt church. Now, how did it get there? The church burns down, they rebuild it, and suddenly in the niche in the church, there's a shroud. Ah, but it's got to be the shroud because it rejuvenates a man and brings him back to life. Does this sound familiar? Isn't there some bishop named Darcy who says that there was an investigation? The presiding cleric over this whole is a Devargy. So the speculation that Dan offers is that there really was a shroud in Besançon. It was the painted copy used to cover for the fact that the shroud had gone to Geoffrey de Charny, and the painting had been commissioned by Jeanne de Varge, and so all this stuff about faking miracles and a painting, that's all true. It just wasn't the Shroud of Turin, it was the painted fake that was trying to cover the fact that they'd snuck the Shroud of Turin out of Besançon and into the hands of the de Charnys. Okay, the French Revolution destroyed the Besançon shroud, otherwise we'd have it, that would be cool. This is an artist rendition of it. This document, I don't have any source on it, it's a 17th century drawing that compares the shroud to the Besançon shroud, which was only half a shroud. It was the front only, which probably tells you something about how the shroud had been traditionally exhibited at Besançon, because they didn't know that there was a back, maybe. So there was a front only, and this is the shroud, pretty crude. This is a drawing of it, and I don't know if the actual painting was as crude as this, but that's the one that the French Revolution destroyed. Well, what's the more complicated story? Well, there's a more complicated story, and that's that the Othon de la Roche, if you had valuable stuff, you wanted a powerful protector. The Knights Templar maintained a whole bunch of castles which ended up being kind of like banks because they protected stuff for people. It's not unreasonable that Othon de la Roche, who we know had a shroud, might have not given it to, but given it into the keeping of the Knights Templar. We don't know. The Knights Templar, knowing what it was, might very well have used it in initiation rites. And there's some rumors that they did. The rumors, whenever you have secret rites, any of the, like Masons or even the Knights of Columbus, they have these rites where you go through ceremonials and you're not supposed to tell anybody about the ceremonial, and the result is there's all kinds of rumors that run around about what do they do there. Well, there were rumors that the Knights Templar were worshiping a head and committing sexually obscene acts and all kinds of things. Well, there was a reason for these rumors. The Knights Templar had a lot of money. They had a lot of castles. Henry VIII did something similar not too terribly long after this, and got a lot of monasteries and a lot of castles and things. Well, this is somebody who's ahead of the game, and he moved in on the Templars, accused them of heresy, had them seized and put under torture
And under torture, at least one of the claims was that they were made to kiss a two-headed image with 4 feet. A two-headed image with 4 feet. Huh. Then on March 18, 1314, the Templar leaders were sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. Jacques de Molay, Geoffrey de Charny.
Huh?
Who's this guy? This is 1314. Master of Normandy, proclaim their innocence and their burns.
They changed their testimony. They say we were forced to say those things. We didn't mean them. It's not true. And they were burned to death for their trouble. But one of them has a name very similar to Geoffrey de Charny. We don't have any evidence that they're related. But isn't that weird?
He bears a name very familiar to us. So perhaps that's a key to how it got to Geoffrey. Here's a sort of an artistic reproduction of the Templar ritual, which comes from Ray Downing's The Real Face of Jesus presentation. That's a kind of a fascinating one. It shows the cloth being displayed hung over a bar. And this time it has 2 heads, a head here, a head on the other side, 4 feet, 2 on one side, 2 on the other side. The Templars were presumably expected, based on their testimony, to kiss the feet of the image on the shroud. These are some frames that were taken from the Ray Downing video that kind of depict that. It's not unreasonable. What about the sudarium? I want you to see the sudarium. What about this second linen? It left Palestine in 614 AD to escape a Persian army that arrived from Spain. It arrived in Spain around 1618. Remember, Spain is under the control of the Muslims, and as well, or at least they're coming into Spain, and it moves north in Spain and ends up in Oviedo. The belief is, after careful study, was that with Christ actually on the cross, in order to preserve the blood that would otherwise flow from the body through the mouth, the pleural fluid from the lungs, and the fact that he'd been stabbed, his head was wrapped with the shroud, with the sudarium of Oviedo. They couldn't wrap it all the way around because the head was up against the cross, so they only partially wrapped it. And then somebody held their hand to the cloth to keep it in place as he was taken off the cross. He was laid on the ground for a period of time. The cloth was secured in place, and the body was carried. Again, how would you carry the body? You might carry the body on another cloth, because there are other cloths that are testified to by pilgrims that went to the Holy Land that didn't have images on them. Now, the interesting thing is that people who have studied this indicate that I made this one, but this one was in the Ray Downing image, and this one is in a book on the sudarium. All show that there's correspondences between the blood and the image on the shroud that actually map geometrically to the shroud. This is the back of the head being morphed by Alan Wanger's technique of changing polarizers, and it shows that there's some correlation between the blood on the shroud, which is there, and the blood on the sudarium of Oviedo. There's more blood on the sudarium, which you might expect, because it was against the head. And by the time the head was lying against the shroud, there was less blood because some of it had been taken off by the sudarium. The interesting thing is, these correspondences are on a cloth that has never been together, the 2 cloths that have never been together in our knowledge, because the image, the Shroud of Turin left Jerusalem sometime and moved either via Antioch or directly to Edessa, thence to Constantinople, thence to Athens, thence to Besançon, thence to Liri, Chambéry, and Turin. Meanwhile, the Sudarium of Oviedo left Jerusalem in 614 and traveled to Seville in about 618 and ultimately north ahead of the Muslims to Toledo and then to Oviedo. And except for Jerusalem, these claws have never been together. Never. So how come they have the blood on both claws is type AB? They can both contain pollens from Jerusalem. They have blood stains that correlate closely with blood stains on both claws. I think this is pretty powerful evidence that it's. This is just sort of by way of review. Here's a plausibility map of what we've talked about today. We've covered the history of the Shroud of Turin, much of it conjectural, but much of it pretty strong, I think. And we see that, that the Sudarium is a particularly interesting correlate. We've seen the Mandylion influencing art, which through the Vignon markings can be connected to the Shroud. It can doubly be connected through the tetradiplon idea. We're going to look at, next week, we're going to look at some other things. We've established, I think, today that a plausible prehistory exists. But what is the Shroud? What is the image? How did it get on the Shroud? Can we make one? Next time, we're going to talk about the image and the skeptics. So I hope you'll be here next time.